Hi, I'm Margo Clabo. Welcome to my sewing room. Today I'd like to share some tips with you about how I make my bindings for my quilts. The technique I'm going to demonstrate today is a faux-piped binding, also called a mini flange, but this technique will also work for a regular French fold binding. I cut my strips 1.5 and 1 3/4 inches wide, and the PDF that accompanies this video will tell you exactly how to do that. But I need to join my strips to make a continuous line to stitch around the quilt. The easiest way for me to do that is to sew them on the sewing machine on a bias angle. The quickest way to do that is to drop my sewing machine needle into the down position, scoot up a rotary ruler up against it, and drop my presser foot to hold it snugly in place. Then I take a Sharpie marker and mark the blue painter's tape with a line that is a reference line directly in front of my sewing machine needle. That way I don't need to mark any of my strips to get a bias angle. I will start by stitching on a starty-stoppy so I don't have to deal with thread tails, and the needle in the down position. With the first piece of bias of straight binding right side up, I'll take the second piece and turn it right side down. This creates a valley at the top and a hill at the bottom. I'm going to take my first valley and snug it up against the needle. I'm going to line up the first hill with the line that I drew on the blue painter's tape. Now I just need to stitch, keeping this lined up with the line on the painter's tape so I get a straight line across. Now I just turn that tail over to the right side up. The next piece is added with the right side down. I just stitch across to the valley, line up the hill, and stitch across. Again, line up right side up, right side down, go across to the valley, line up the hill, keep it on the line on the tape to the other side. Now for this technique I'm using two different colors of binding strips. The next ones are dark, and in the real world I would change my thread, but I'm going to leave it light for now. But it's the same way. These binding strips are a little bit wider, but the technique is exactly the same. I stitch to the valley, line up the hill, and stitch right across. Again, right side up, right side down, stitch to the valley, line up the hill. And now the last one, and I'd like to show you that it does not have to be exactly a 45-degree angle. If I take that and lay it at a weird angle, and this is at a weird angle also, this is not a 45-degree angle. I'm going to stitch it through there, and again, I've started at the valley. I'm going to line up the hill with the line. Get my starty-stoppy. Now you can see that that is not a 45-degree angle here. It's weird, but when it opens out, that's a straight line across there. So the angle doesn't matter. Going from valley to hill with this seam line is what gives us the straight line across. I'm going to trim these apart. I'm going to trim off all of the excess and the dog ears. I'll take this to the ironing board and press these seams open. When I get done with that, I'll be right back. Okay, My seams are trimmed and they're all pressed open. Now I need to join these two pieces of fabric with a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance on the right side. This tape is not being used for this because that line lines up with my needle, and I need to sew a 1/4 inch seam, so I am paying attention to the side of my presser foot and the little notch that I know on my machine will give me a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is not a step that's necessary if you're using one piece of fabric, but for this technique we have to add this extra seam. So I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam the entire length of my binding strip, and I'll show you what to do next. Okay, my binding strips are all stitched together. I've got the binding is the white color and the piping is the dark color on this sample. The 1/4 inch seam allowance is sewn. I will carefully press the seam allowance towards the binding fabric and away from the piping fabric. After that is done, I will line up the raw edges, and that will leave me with about a 1/8 inch reveal of the piping color. After it's carefully pressed, it makes a very nice faux piping. Now I'm ready to attach it to my quilt. I have prepared my quilt. This is the quilt top, and I have stitched less than a 1/4 of an inch stay stitching around the outside edge and trimmed away the excess batting and backing. This binding will be attached to the back of the quilt, which is the dark color in this case, and I'm going to stitch the binding strip with the piping color up, so the piping color matches the backing color. I need to determine before I stitch this how wide my seam allowance needs to be. I can test that by folding my binding strip into thirds, finger press it. I'm going to mark that crease so that I can see it. I'm going to try to determine what my seam allowance needs to be to make the perfect fold. I've lined up my raw edges, and now I'll take this to the machine and put my presser foot down with, I've switched to my walking foot. The raw edge of the fabric is under the right side of my presser foot. When my needle is in the default position in the center, I will not hit that mark that I made. So I need to adjust my needle position to the right, and if I drop it down, you can see that it falls right in that chalked line. I'm going to stitch with a long basting stitch for about 5 or 6 inches to test my seam allowance. Take it out of the machine. So I've got this line of basting. I'm going to turn the quilt to where I can pull that from the backing side and fold it over to the front side, and that's exactly what we want to see. It's just a very fine line of the faux piping. To test my seam allowance, I'm going to put a needle in between the piping and the binding on the front, and let's see what we get on the back. That falls really close. I think I'm going to move my needle one more position to the right, which will make my seam allowance narrower, which means if I make a narrower seam allowance, this basting line has to come out. If you've got your binding strips on the straight of grain and your quilt is already quilted, you can use the Ricky Timms method of unstitching. I do this only with basting stitches and when everything's on the straight of grain. Okay, pull these threads out and let's try this again. Sometimes it takes several tries. This can change depending on the thickness of your batting and the density of your quilting, and a lot of things can vary. So I have moved my needle position one more to the right. Let's try this. Take it out, flip it over, bend it back. Okay, can you see I've pinned it right between the binding and the piping? And that is a pretty good lineup right there. I think I like this needle position. And because I know that's the right needle position, I'm just going to leave everything the way it is, but I'm going to change my stitch length back from a basting stitch down to, I usually do a little longer than the default on this. I was practicing, I was showing you on a scrap piece of binding, but now I'm going to add the binding around this little quilt. And I'm going to leave about a 5 or 6 inch tail. Line up my raw edges. And I've changed my stitch length. So I'm going to stitch to the corner. When I get to the corner, I'll make this turn just like any other French fold binding. Because this is a different seam allowance than 1/4 of an inch, I can't just stop 1/4 of an inch from the edge and back off. That would be the wrong width. So in order to determine where I need to stop stitching, I'll fold the binding back at a 45-degree angle so that this is all straight here. Finger press it so that this is right at the end of the quilt, and I can see that fold right there. I've marked it with a little chalk. I'm going to stitch and stop with my needle right in that chalked line. Raise the presser foot, turn the quilt, drop the presser foot, back off, take it out, just like any other binding. I'm going to fold this away from the quilt, double it back. Now I want to make sure this fold is lined up with the raw edge, and there's no overlap where the folds are. Line that up for the next edge, back under the needle with the raw edges on the right side of my presser foot. Okay, now we're ready to make the final join. This is the tail that I started with, and I left 6 or 8 inches extra before I started stitching. I'm going to take that first tail and lay it down on my quilt, aligning the raw edges, and I'm going to fold it back on top of itself. Doing that, I can just take a pair of scissors and make one clip, and I've got a straight edge. I need to cut this side to overlap this first one the width of my binding. I could either measure that, which a lot of people do, or I can take this tail I just cut off, open it up, lay one edge where I cut. That shows me the width of my binding strips as they're cut. I will lay this other strip on top of it. Again, I need a straight edge cut, so I'll fold it back so that this fold is on the other end of that little strip of binding. So what I have effectively done is cut a straight edge on this piece and a straight edge on this piece, and they overlap the width of my binding. And like I say, this is going to work with a single piece of binding also. Now it's just a matter of joining these with a 45-degree angle, just like when we joined the strips to begin with. Because I've still got the tape on my sewing machine, I need to open this piece with the right side up, open the piece on the left with the right sides down, and I simply overlap those, lining up the corners. You'll probably need to fold your quilt to give yourself some gap space in there. And this is one place, I'm not a pinner, but this is one place where I will definitely use pins. I will pin 3 different corners where they overlap. So when I put this back down, I can tell that that is going to work great. I'll take this to back to my sewing machine, and a lot of people we need to sew from this corner to this corner, and a lot of people will take a ruler and they'll draw a line and then they'll sew it. But because we've still got the tape on the sewing machine, this is so easy. Okay, you can see that the binding is attached up here. This is the end we started with, down here. And this is where I've overlapped my join. If you flip that up, you'll give yourself more space to work. The one coming down from the top needs to open right side up. The piece coming up from the bottom needs to line up right side down, which is exactly the way we joined the strips in the first place. Now, because I'm using my tape with my line on it, that's lined up with the center. Now remember, my needle position has been changed, so I'm going to remember where that needle position is, but for now I'm going back to the default position, which is in the center. I can use a starty-stoppy here to get that thread out of the way. Instead of looking for a valley now, I'm looking for the point where this overlaps. That's where I'm going to start stitching. I'm going to remove that first pin and line up the bottom piece of fabric. Has a point on it right here, and that's what I'm lining up with the line on my masking tape. And as long as I keep this lined up right here, I'm stitching directly across that piece of binding. sturdy stoppie with no thread tails to deal with. Now you can see that I've stitched from where these two cross up here to where they cross down here. Using the tape, I've got a straight line. It's always a good idea when you get to this point to test that before you trim it. So pull this out of the way. And I can see that that's going to work. That's going to fit in the space just fine. So I will take that now trim this off. I'll open it up and finger press it. Press it with a wooden iron. Now I want to be sure that's going to work. When I stretch it out, it's a perfect fit. Put it back under the presser foot. Now remember, I moved my needle position, so now I have to put it back where it was when I was sewing on my binding. I can tell you that the bigger gap you leave to do this, the easier it is. That was a generous sized gap. Sometimes you don't have that much if you're working on a really small quilt. But there is my final join. Even with this mini piping, I've got a nice final join that is indistinguishable from the rest of them. And my seam, when I turn it over and stitch it, is going to be just right. At this point, I will take my quilt to the ironing board and I will iron from the back of the quilt to make sure I've got a good firm fold at the back of the quilt to get that out of the way. You have to be careful doing this if you've got any kind of marking on your quilt top that would be heat set. You do not want to heat set it if you've got like the blue markers or something that would be heat set. So I'm going to take this to the iron now and really press that good, and then I'll come back and show you what I do next. Okay, now that the seam allowance has been firmly pressed away from the back of the quilt, I've turned it to the front. Now there are two ways to get the binding secure so that you can stitch it down. You can fold it over and use your pins to pin right along between the piping and the binding, the way we tested for our seam allowance. And you can do that around the entire perimeter of the quilt. Check on the back to make sure that your pins are falling just outside the binding. An easier way for me to do that is a trick I learned from Sharon Schomburg, and that is using Elmer's washable school glue. I have retrofitted my tip so that I can get a very fine line of glue, and there is a PDF in my classroom about how to do that. I'm especially careful with the corners because they tend to shift, so I am going to run a fine line of glue right along the edge of my piping fabric. Tuck some down in that corner so it'll stay put, and across this top edge. Carefully fold it over. And when I'm doing it on this wonderful ironing surface, I can pin straight down into my ironing surface to hold it securely until I can iron it. And when we get to the corners, you want to fold them until you've got a good 45-degree angle, and sometimes it takes a little finagling. Until you get it just where you want it. The glue will hold until you heat set it. And I'll go around the entire quilt like this, and before I stitch it, I will check my pin position through the piping and binding again to make sure it's where I want it. But see how nicely that stays with no pins whatsoever. I'll finish gluing this and then take it to the machine and show you how I stitch it. Okay, I've switched to a number 10 edge stitch foot, which is recommended by Ricky Timms for his real piped binding. It's got this blade on the front that I can run right between the piping and the binding, right in the ditch there. Now, because my bindings are folded over with glue, I've got no pins in the way, but I have checked to make sure that this is glued in the right place. And you're welcome to use pins. You don't have to use the glue, but you can use pins. And now I'm just going to stitch in the ditch between the piping and the binding, and let's see what we get. When I get to this end down here, this folded corner sometimes causes an issue with the blade. You just have to keep a close eye on it. I also wanted to let you know that I've got monofilament in the top because I'm stitching between very high contrasting fabrics. I didn't want my stitches to miss and be very obvious. Okay, let's see what we've got. Well, I'm pleased with that. Pretty good corner. Pretty good corner. And that's the way we want it to look, right close to the edge of the folded edge of the binding on the back of the quilt. The corners should be neat. And on the other side, I maybe could have folded that one a little better. But I'm pleased with that. It's a fast way to put a binding on, especially on a quilt for a child or something that's going to get a lot of wear, because it is a very secure binding. I hope you'll try this, add it to your arsenal of quilting tools, and have a good time with it. It's a new day every day.